Denise Whitaker would remember this night for the rest of her life, not because of what was said, but because of how quickly a house that had never once felt like home turned into a place she was being warned to leave. The rain had started an hour earlier, quiet at first, then heavy enough to blur the tall windows of the Sinclair estate into sheets of gray. She had been called down from the East Wing without explanation, summoned the way staff are summoned when something has already been decided without them. She walked into the marble foyer expecting a complaint about the linens or the schedule. Instead, she found Eleanor Sinclair standing perfectly still beneath the chandelier, arms folded, waiting for her the way a judge waits for a verdict she has already written herself. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, back to Denise, standing in that foyer, with no idea that the next 60 seconds would change the direction of her entire life. She had walked this hallway hundreds of times before, always with a cart of cleaning supplies, always with her eyes down, always thinking about her son's next appointment or the light bill she still needed to pay. Tonight she walked it with nothing in her hands and no task waiting for her, which was, in itself, unusual enough to make her stomach tighten before she even reached the foyer. The house was dimmer than usual, most of the lamps switched off for the night, leaving only the chandelier above the entryway glowing against the dark like something left burning on purpose. She could hear her own footsteps against the marble, small and uncertain, swallowed almost immediately by the sound of the storm outside. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Power, in her world, was never loud. It was simply certain. She looked at Denise the way she looked at contracts that had already been signed, already sealed, already beyond negotiation. Rain kept striking the windows behind her, and somewhere upstairs a door closed, though no one else in the house was supposed to be awake. Denise felt the temperature of the room shift before Eleanor said a single word, the way people feel a change in weather in their bones before the sky ever confirms it. She had learned, over 3 years of working in this house, to read the difference between an ordinary bad mood and something aimed directly at her. This was aimed directly at her. "You have 1 week," Eleanor said, and the words landed with the flatness of someone reading a sentence she had rehearsed more than once in front of a mirror. 1 week to remove yourself from my son's life, quietly, without explanation, without a scene. After that, I promise you, you will not find work cleaning a single house in this city again." Denise opened her mouth, certain there had been some misunderstanding, certain this was about a broken vase or a misplaced key. But Eleanor's eyes told her otherwise. There was no confusion in them, no room for negotiation, only the calm, terrible certainty of a woman who had already decided how this story would end, long before Denise had even realized she was in one. For a moment, the only sound in the house was the rain, relentless against the glass, and the low groan of thunder somewhere far off toward the river. Denise thought of her son, asleep in a hospital bed 2 miles from where she stood, his heart working harder than any 9-year-old's heart should ever have to work. She thought of Marcus, the man Eleanor was so determined to protect her from, and how strange it felt to be threatened over a friendship that had never once crossed a single unspoken line, not yet. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to ask what she had possibly done to deserve a warning this cold, delivered in a foyer this beautiful, by a woman who had never once raised her voice above a whisper her entire life. Eleanor did not wait for an answer. She turned before Denise could speak, her heels striking the marble floor in slow, unhurried steps, each one echoing louder than it should have in a house this large. At the base of the staircase, she paused, just long enough to say one final thing over her shoulder, without turning back around. "I have buried things far more complicated than a housekeeper before," she said. "Do not make me start with you." And then she climbed the stairs, leaving Denise standing alone beneath a chandelier that suddenly felt far too bright for a night that had just turned so dark? Denise never got the chance to answer. That was the last word Eleanor Sinclair gave her that night, and it would echo through the rest of this story far longer than either of them could have imagined in that moment. To understand how a friendship built on kindness turned into a war fought in marble hallways and hospital corridors, we have to go back 6 months earlier, back to the first ordinary morning Denise Whitaker ever walked through the doors of the Sinclair estate, back before any of them knew how much they were about to lose, and how much one buried secret was about to cost them all. 6 months before that night in the marble foyer, Denise Whitaker woke up at 4:45 in the morning in a small house in East Point. The way she woke up every single day, before the sun, before the birds, before the rest of the city had even considered opening its eyes. She made coffee she didn't have time to finish, checked on her son Elijah, still asleep with his stuffed dog tucked under one arm, and left the house quietly enough not to wake him. 2 bus transfers stood between her and the Sinclair estate, 40 minutes each way, rain or shine, and she had made that trip so many times that her body had memorized every turn, every stop, every tired face that boarded alongside her at the same hour, every single morning of the week. The Sinclair estate sat behind iron gates on a street where the houses were so large they seemed to compete with each other rather than simply exist beside one another. Denise had been working there for almost 3 years by the time this story truly begins, hired after the previous housekeeper retired, and kept on because she was, quite simply, better at the job than anyone Eleanor Sinclair had employed before her. She arrived early, left late, and never once complained about the size of the house or the weight of the work, though both were considerable. She had learned early on that the Sinclair family valued competence far more than warmth, and so she gave them competence and kept her warmth for the people who had actually earned it. Renee Ashford, the head housekeeper, noticed Denise's efficiency almost immediately and did not appreciate it the way a reasonable person might have. Renee had been at the estate for over a decade, waiting for a promotion that never quite arrived, and she treated every new arrival as a potential threat rather than a colleague. She was short with Denise in the hallways, quick to correct her over nothing, quicker still to remind her that seniority meant something in this house, even when nobody had asked. Denise absorbed all of it without complaint, the same way she absorbed most difficult things in her life, quietly, without giving anyone the satisfaction of a reaction they could report back to someone with more power than either of them. The first time Denise ever met Eleanor Sinclair face to face, she noticed something she couldn't quite explain. Eleanor had been reviewing new staff paperwork at her desk, barely glancing up at the woman standing in front of her, until her eyes reached the name printed at the top of the form. Whitaker. For half a second, something crossed Eleanor's face, something quick and involuntary, gone before Denise could even be certain she had seen it at all. Eleanor cleared her throat, asked 2 brief questions about experience and availability, and dismissed her without further comment. Denise walked out of that office thinking nothing more of it than that rich women were often strange in ways she didn't have the energy to decode, not realizing she had just witnessed the first crack in a secret 4 decades old. Marcus Sinclair was almost never home during the early months Denise worked there, buried in meetings, mergers, and obligations that came with running a hospitality empire his father had built from nothing. When Denise did see him, it was usually late, long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, sitting alone in a kitchen far too large for one man eating a meal by himself. The first time they actually spoke, it wasn't about business or schedules or anything related to the house at all. He asked her, almost absent-mindedly, whether the coffee she made tasted as good as it smelled, and when she laughed despite herself, something in his shoulders relaxed in a way she hadn't expected from a man people described as unreachable. Their conversations grew slowly, the way trust often does, in small pieces exchanged during unremarkable moments neither of them planned. He learned she had a son. She learned he had lost his father 2 years earlier and still hadn't figured out how to sit in this house, without feeling like a guest in his own life. Neither of them called it friendship out loud, though that was clearly what it had become, something neither of them chased, but both of them noticed. Marcus began lingering in the kitchen later than usual, not because he needed anything, but because he had started looking forward to a version of his evenings that included someone who spoke to him like a person instead of an asset. Denise, meanwhile, carried a weight most people in that house never saw. Her son Elijah had been diagnosed 2 years earlier with a heart condition that required careful monitoring, medication, and regular visits to a cardiologist who always seemed to be searching for the right way to deliver difficult news gently. Elijah, for his part, treated his illness the way most 9-year-olds treat inconvenience, with far more humor than the situation probably deserved, telling his mother that his heart just liked to do things at its own pace. Denise laughed along with him every time, because she had learned that falling apart in front of her son helped absolutely no one, least of all Elijah, who needed her steady more than he needed her honest. That fragile steadiness cracked one Tuesday afternoon, when Elijah's cardiologist called Denise into a small office with too many diplomas on the wall and not enough warmth in his voice. He explained, in the careful language doctors use when they are about to change a family's life, that Elijah's heart valve had deteriorated faster than expected, and that a full replacement surgery was no longer a future consideration but an approaching necessity. He explained the risks of waiting. He explained the cost of not waiting, a number so large it barely felt real, a number insurance would only partially soften. Denise sat perfectly still through all of it, nodding at the right moments, holding herself together with the same quiet discipline that had carried her through every difficult year before this one. She didn't cry until she was back on the bus, forehead against the cool window, rain starting again outside, blurring the city into shapes she didn't recognize. She thought about her son's laughter, his stubborn optimism, the way he still asked about superheroes despite everything his body was quietly fighting against. She thought about the number the doctor had given her, and how far it was from anything she could realistically gather on her own, no matter how many extra shifts she picked up, no matter how carefully she budgeted every dollar she earned. For the first time since Elijah's diagnosis, Denise Whitaker allowed herself to feel afraid, not of losing her job, not of Eleanor Sinclair's cold disapproval, but of something far heavier, the possibility of losing her son. She returned to the estate the next morning anyway, because that was the only version of herself she knew how to be, and because Elijah's surgery, however impossible it seemed, was not going to fund itself through sadness alone. She said nothing to anyone at first, not even to Marcus, though he noticed almost immediately that something in her had shifted, a heaviness behind her eyes she couldn't quite hide no matter how carefully she smiled. It would take another 2 weeks, and one particularly long night in that same enormous kitchen, before she finally told him the truth, unaware that his response to that truth would be the very thing that set Eleanor Sinclair's warning in motion, 6 months before it was ever spoken aloud. Marcus found her that night sitting at the small table near the kitchen window, the one usually reserved for staff meals, staring at a cup of coffee she hadn't touched in almost 20 minutes. He didn't ask what was wrong right away. He simply pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, the way a person sits when they've decided that whatever silence follows is worth waiting through. Denise finally spoke without looking up, telling him about the cardiologist, the deteriorating valve, the number that had been sitting in her chest like a stone ever since she heard it. She hadn't planned on telling him. She had planned on carrying it alone, the way she carried everything else, but something about the quiet in that kitchen made the truth easier to release than to keep holding. Marcus listened without interrupting, without offering the kind of hollow reassurance people give when they don't know what else to say. When she finished, he asked only one question, quiet and direct. What hospital was Elijah in? Denise told him, still not entirely sure why it mattered, and Marcus nodded slowly, filing the information away with the same seriousness he brought to a boardroom decision. She didn't know it yet, but by the following afternoon, a portion of Elijah's outstanding hospital balance had quietly disappeared, paid without a name attached, without a note, without anything that could be traced back to a Sinclair. Denise noticed the adjusted balance 2 days later and sat in the hospital parking lot for almost 10 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. She never confronted him directly, not at first, because some part of her understood that naming it out loud might make him retreat from a kindness that clearly hadn't come easily to him either. Instead, she began leaving small things behind in his kitchen on the days she worked, a plate of food set aside when the house staff had already gone home, a note reminding him to actually eat something before midnight. Marcus began finding reasons to be in the kitchen later than his schedule required, telling himself it had nothing to do with timing, though everyone who worked in that house could have told him otherwise. Renee Ashford certainly noticed, and said nothing, filing the information away the same way she filed every piece of leverage she thought might someday prove useful. Vanessa Sinclair Cole noticed too, though she noticed differently than Renee did. As chief operating officer of the family's hospitality empire, Vanessa spent most of her time studying leverage, patterns, and risk, and her brother's mood had become a pattern she didn't like. Marcus had started smiling in meetings again, something he hadn't done consistently since before their father's death, and when Vanessa finally asked him directly what had changed, he gave her an answer vague enough to confirm exactly what she suspected. She didn't raise the subject with their mother immediately. She preferred, always, to gather more information before she moved, the same instinct that had made her indispensable to the company and quietly feared by almost everyone who worked beneath her. Eleanor Sinclair learned about the shift in her son's mood the way she learned about most things in her own house, through careful observation rather than direct conversation. She watched him linger near the kitchen at hours he never used to keep. She watched the way his shoulders eased when a particular housekeeper's name came up in casual conversation among staff. And she remembered, with a discomfort she refused to examine too closely, the name printed at the top of an employment form months earlier, a name she had hoped, foolishly, might simply pass through her house without meaning anything at all. Whitaker. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself the same thing every night for weeks, and every night, she believed it a little less. It was Renee who finally gave Vanessa the opening she needed, though not entirely on purpose. Passed over yet again for the promotion she believed she had earned through a decade of loyalty, Renee complained one evening to Vanessa about how Denise had been given additional responsibilities within the household staff. Responsibilities Renee felt should have come to her instead. Vanessa listened with far more interest than the complaint deserved, recognizing immediately that Renee's bitterness could be shaped into something useful. She didn't offer Renee the promotion outright. She simply asked a few careful questions about Denise's daily routine, her access to different parts of the house, and whether anyone would find it particularly strange if something valuable happened to go missing. Renee understood the implication faster than Vanessa expected her to, and to her lasting shame, she didn't hesitate nearly as long as she should have before agreeing. The plan itself was almost embarrassingly simple. A piece of jewelry belonging to Eleanor, an heirloom bracelet with sentimental rather than enormous financial value, would be reported missing at exactly the moment Denise had unsupervised access to that section of the house. Renee would be the one to notice it gone. Renee would be the one to suggest, gently at first, that perhaps someone new to the household might not fully understand which items were off limits. It required no evidence, only suspicion, and in a house built on quiet hierarchies, suspicion aimed at the right person rarely needed evidence at all. The morning it happened, Denise had no idea her life was about to be rearranged over a piece of jewelry she had never once touched. She arrived at her usual hour, greeted the morning the way she greeted every morning, with quiet determination and a mental list of tasks that had nothing to do with heirloom bracelets or family secrets. She didn't notice Renee watching her more closely than usual. She didn't notice Eleanor's schedule had been cleared for reasons no one had explained to the staff. She simply worked, the way she always worked, unaware that somewhere upstairs, a story was already being written about her, one designed to end with her walking out of that house in disgrace, long before she ever discovered why. By mid-morning, the house had shifted into something Denise could feel before she could name it, the particular tension of a room where everyone already knows something except the person standing in the middle of it. She was pulling fresh linens from the hallway closet on the second floor when Renee appeared beside her, arms folded, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "Have you seen Mrs. Sinclair's bracelet?" Renee asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was an opening line in a script she had already memorized. Denise said no, confused, assuming this was simply another item added to her already long list of responsibilities. She had no way of knowing that her answer, however honest, had already been rendered irrelevant by a decision made the night before in a conversation she was never part of. Eleanor arrived within the hour, moving through the house with the brisk, contained fury of a woman who had convinced herself she was simply protecting what was hers. She didn't ask Denise a single question before ordering her bag searched, right there in the servants' hallway, in front of two other staff members who suddenly found urgent reasons to be nearby. Denise stood with her arms slightly away from her sides, humiliation rising in her chest faster than she could control it. Watching a stranger's hands move through her belongings, her lunch container, her son's crumpled drawing she carried for luck, her entire life laid open on a hallway table for an audience that had already decided what they expected to find. The bracelet, of course, was not in her bag, because Denise had never taken it, had never even seen it outside of the one photograph Renee had shown around days earlier under the guise of admiring it. Eleanor's face didn't soften with the empty search. It hardened instead, as though the absence of evidence were simply proof of how carefully the theft had been planned. "Perhaps you hid it elsewhere," Eleanor said, quiet and clipped, the words landing like a verdict rather than a suggestion. Denise felt something break loose inside her chest, not sadness this time, but a slow, rising anger at being accused of something she hadn't done, judged by a woman who had decided her guilt before a single fact had been established. It was Marcus who found the bracelet an hour later, exactly where Eleanor herself had left it weeks earlier, tucked inside a jewelry box in her own dressing room, beneath a velvet tray she rarely lifted. He walked into the hallway holding it up without a word, letting the silence do the work his anger wanted to do instead. Eleanor's expression flickered, something between embarrassment and refusal to apologize, the particular discomfort of a woman unaccustomed to being proven wrong in front of her own staff. Marcus didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone shifted permanently in that moment, something the household staff would talk about quietly for weeks afterward. "You searched her belongings over something that was never missing," he said. "You owe her an apology, not an explanation." Eleanor did not apologize, not that day, not in the hallway, not in front of witnesses who might carry the story beyond these walls. She simply turned and walked away, the same unhurried, unshaken walk Denise would come to recognize months later as the sound of a decision already being finalized. Marcus stayed behind, apologizing on his mother's behalf, though both of them understood it wasn't really his apology to give. Denise accepted it quietly, gathering her scattered belongings back into her bag, her hands trembling slightly from adrenaline rather than fear. She said nothing about how close she had come to losing everything over a bracelet she'd never touched, though the fear of it would sit with her for days, a reminder of exactly how little protection she actually had in that house. What none of them understood yet, not Marcus, not Denise, not even Renee, who had begun to feel the first uncomfortable pang of guilt over what she'd participated in, was that Eleanor's reaction had never really been about a missing bracelet at all. It had been about control, about proving to herself that she still held the power to remove any threat from her son's life before it became something she couldn't undo. The bracelet was simply the tool closest at hand. Denise Whitaker's name was the real target, though Eleanor herself couldn't have fully explained why that name unsettled her so deeply, only that it did, in a way she had spent 40 years trying not to examine too closely. Vanessa watched the entire incident unfold from a distance, disappointed not that the plan had failed, but that it had failed so quickly and so publicly, with her brother positioned as the hero rather than the useful distraction she had hoped he would remain. She said nothing to her mother about her own involvement, allowing Eleanor to believe Renee had acted alone out of simple workplace jealousy. Privately, however, Vanessa recognized that a clumsier approach would be required going forward, one that didn't rely on evidence that could be found and returned within a single afternoon. She began, quietly, to consider other ways to remove Denise from her brother's life, ways that wouldn't require jewelry, witnesses, or anything that could be so easily disproven. Denise returned home that evening changed in a way she couldn't fully articulate to Naomi Bishop, the one friend who had known her long enough to notice immediately that something had shifted. Over tea at Denise's kitchen table, long after Elijah had fallen asleep, she recounted the hallway search, the cold accusation, Marcus's unexpected defense. Naomi listened with the particular attentiveness of a nurse trained to notice what people don't say out loud, and when Denise finished, she asked only one question. Does he know what you're risking by staying in that house? Denise didn't answer right away, because the honest answer, the one she wasn't ready to admit even to herself, was that she no longer knew whether she was staying for the paycheck, or for something far more complicated that had quietly taken root in that enormous, lonely kitchen. The days following the bracelet incident carried a strange, uneasy calm, the kind that settles over a house right before something is about to shift again. Denise continued arriving each morning at the same hour, doing her work with the same quiet precision, though she noticed Eleanor watching her now with a different kind of attention, something colder and more deliberate than simple suspicion. Marcus, for his part, made a point of being kinder to her in front of the staff, not out of guilt exactly, but out of something closer to protectiveness, as though he understood, without either of them saying it aloud, that his mother's silence was not the end of the matter, but merely a pause before her next move. That pause ended on a Thursday afternoon, when Denise was called into the estate's administrative office and informed, in careful, bloodless language, that her position was being eliminated as part of a household restructuring. No one mentioned the bracelet. No one mentioned Marcus. The woman delivering the news, a mid-level administrator who clearly hadn't been told the real reason behind the decision, simply handed Denise a final paycheck and a folder of paperwork, thanking her for her 3 years of service, as though those years amounted to nothing more than a line item being adjusted on a budget sheet. Denise asked no questions, because she already understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has learned to read between the lines of power, exactly what kind of restructuring this really was. Renee Ashford was given Denise's responsibilities within the week, along with the promotion she had wanted for over a decade, though the victory felt hollow in a way she hadn't expected. She told herself she had simply been in the right place when an opportunity presented itself, the same story she repeated privately every time guilt threatened to surface. She avoided Denise's name in conversation after that, and flinched slightly whenever another staff member mentioned her, a small, involuntary reaction she couldn't quite explain even to herself, buried somewhere beneath the promotion she had finally gotten and could no longer fully enjoy. Denise assumed, at first, that finding new work would simply be a matter of time and persistence, the same way it had always been. She reached out to the staffing agencies she had used years earlier, confident in her experience and her spotless record. What she found instead was a wall of vague refusals, agencies suddenly unable to place her, families who had seemed interested one week and unreachable the next. It took her almost 2 weeks to understand that this wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern, and patterns like this one rarely happened by accident in a city where the Sinclair name opened doors and, apparently, could close them just as easily. While Denise fought quietly to keep her family afloat, Elijah's condition took a turn that no one had prepared her for. What had been a manageable, monitored heart condition suddenly accelerated overnight. His breathing labored in a way that sent Naomi rushing him to the emergency room before Denise had even finished getting dressed. The surgery that had once been described as an approaching necessity was now, according to the cardiologist's grim assessment, an urgent one, with a timeline measured in weeks rather than months. Denise sat beside her son's hospital bed that night, holding his small hand, listening to machines mark the rhythm of a heart working harder than it should have to, and felt something in her that had always held steady begin, quietly, to crack. At almost the exact same time, in a boardroom 2 miles away, Eleanor Sinclair was making an announcement of her own, one designed to solve a different kind of problem entirely. She stood before the company's senior leadership and revealed, without warning, without asking her son's opinion, that merger discussions with the Reyes family's hospitality group had progressed to the point of a formal engagement between Marcus and Isabel Reyes. She framed it as strategic, necessary, even inevitable, citing stock projections and market positioning as though she were describing a business acquisition rather than her own son's future. Marcus, seated at the far end of the table, heard the announcement at the same moment as everyone else in the room, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know him well enough to see the anger settling quietly behind his eyes. He confronted his mother that evening in her study, the first real argument between them in years, though Eleanor remained maddeningly composed throughout, treating his objections as a phase to be managed rather than a decision to be respected. She reminded him of his father's legacy, of the company's obligations, of the responsibilities that came with the Sinclair name, every argument constructed to make his resistance sound selfish rather than reasonable. Marcus left the study that night more furious than he could ever remember being in his adult life, unaware that 2 miles across the city, the woman he had quietly grown to care for was sitting in a hospital chair, watching her son's chest rise and fall, fighting a battle of her own that no boardroom announcement could touch. Neither of them knew it yet, but they were being crushed by the same family, in different rooms, for entirely different reasons, at exactly the same hour. Isabel Reyes, for her part, accepted the engagement announcement with practiced grace, though privately she harbored no illusions about what this arrangement actually was, a business transaction wearing the appearance of romance, useful to her own family's ambitions regardless of whether Marcus's heart was actually in it. She had grown up inside rooms just like Eleanor's study, and she understood, better than most, that some marriages were never really about love at all. What she didn't yet understand was how quickly this particular arrangement was about to become far more complicated than either family had anticipated. Vanessa Sinclair Cole did not visit Denise Whitaker's home by accident. She had spent the better part of a week gathering information quietly, the address, the hospital, the surgery date, until she understood exactly what kind of leverage circumstance had handed her. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon, dressed in a way that made the modest East Point Street feel smaller somehow, and knocked on Denise's door with the composed confidence of someone who had never once doubted the outcome of a negotiation in her life. Denise opened the door already tired, already stretched thin from 2 consecutive nights at the hospital, and felt her stomach drop the moment she recognized the woman standing on her porch. Vanessa didn't waste time on pleasantries. She stepped just inside the doorway, glanced briefly at the modest living room behind Denise, and got straight to the purpose of her visit. She explained, in the calm, transactional tone she used for closing business deals, that she was prepared to cover the full cost of Elijah's surgery, every dollar of it, without requiring a single form or hospital negotiation. The only condition, she said, was that Denise disappeared quietly from Marcus's life, no explanation offered to him, no dramatic farewell, simply an absence he would eventually stop questioning. She placed a folder on the small kitchen table as she said it, as though the offer itself were already a formality awaiting only a signature. Denise stared at the folder longer than she wanted to admit, because the number written across the top of that first page represented something she had lain awake calculating for weeks, unable to make the math work no matter how many extra shifts she picked up. For one unbearable moment, she allowed herself to imagine Elijah waking up from surgery, healthy, laughing, free of the machines that had monitored his heart for 2 long years. Vanessa watched her hesitate, and something in her expression suggested she had expected exactly this reaction, the pause of a woman being offered the one thing she wanted most, wrapped inside a condition designed to cost her everything else. "You don't have to decide right now," Vanessa said, sliding the folder slightly closer across the table, her voice softening just enough to sound like kindness rather than strategy. "But surgeries like this don't wait for sentiment, Ms. Whitaker. Neither does my patience." She left without waiting for an answer, the same unhurried exit Denise had come to recognize as a family trait, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving Denise alone at her kitchen table with a folder full of numbers large enough to save her son's life, attached to a condition designed to erase her own. That night, Denise sat beside Elijah's hospital bed long after visiting hours technically ended, a small mercy the night nurse allowed without comment. Elijah drifted in and out of sleep, tethered to monitors that beeped in a rhythm Denise had memorized without meaning to, a rhythm she found herself listening for even in her own quiet moments at home. She held his hand, smaller than it should have been for a boy his age, and thought about the folder still sitting untouched on her kitchen table, about the life it promised to buy him, about the version of herself it required her to erase in exchange. She had never once, in 9 years of motherhood, faced a choice this cruel in its simplicity. Elijah stirred sometime past midnight, opening his eyes just enough to find his mother's face in the dim hospital light. He asked, in the half-serious tone children use when they sense more than adults think they do, whether something was wrong with the nice hotel man. Noticing, the way children always notice, the absence of a name Denise had mentioned more often than she realized over recent months. Denise told him nothing was wrong, though her voice wavered slightly on the word nothing, enough for Elijah to study her face a moment longer before speaking again, sleepy but certain, the way only a child delivering an important truth can be. "Don't give him up because of me," he said. "My heart's tough. It can wait for both things to work out." Denise sat with that sentence long after Elijah drifted back to sleep, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over every difficult decision she had ever made for her son. She thought about her grandmother, a woman she barely remembered but had heard stories about her whole life, a woman who had supposedly worked her entire life for dignity rather than comfort, and never once let anyone convince her that dignity was negotiable. She thought about Marcus, about the quiet kindness he had shown her, about how unfair it felt that loving anyone in this story seemed to require losing something essential of herself in exchange. By sunrise, she had made her decision, though it was not the decision Vanessa Sinclair Cole had been counting on. She did not call the number on the folder. Instead, she called Marcus directly, something she had never done outside the walls of that enormous kitchen, and asked him to meet her, not at the estate, but somewhere neutral, somewhere his family's shadow couldn't quite reach. She told him everything, the visit, the folder, the number, the condition attached to it. Watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something far colder as the full weight of what his own sister had done settled over him. For the first time since his father's death, Marcus Sinclair understood, without any remaining doubt, exactly how far the people who shared his last name were willing to go to control the shape of his life, and exactly how little they had ever considered what that control might cost the people caught underneath it. Marcus left that meeting with Denise carrying a fury he hadn't felt in years, but underneath the anger sat a question he couldn't quite shake loose. Vanessa was calculating, yes, but she had never been reckless, and offering that kind of money to make a housekeeper disappear felt disproportionate to anything he understood about his sister's usual concerns. There had to be a reason beyond simple protectiveness over the family name, something deeper that made Denise Whitaker specifically worth this level of effort to remove. He thought back to his mother's reaction the day the bracelet went missing, the flicker of something unreadable when the name Whitaker had first crossed her desk months earlier. He decided, driving home that night, that he was done accepting his family's silence as an answer. He went straight to Walter Grimes, the attorney who had managed Sinclair family affairs for over 30 years, a man who had drafted contracts for Charles Sinclair back when the company was still a single struggling in rather than an empire. Grimes had always been careful, discreet, loyal in the particular way old family lawyers are loyal, more to the institution than to any single member of it. Marcus found him in his office late on a Tuesday evening and asked him directly what his mother and sister were protecting, watching the older man's face carefully for any sign of the deflection he had grown used to receiving from everyone else in his family. For a long moment, Grimes said nothing at all, simply looking at Marcus the way a man looks at someone he has been waiting years to finally ask him the right question. Grimes rose slowly, walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of his office, and retrieved a thin folder he had clearly kept close for longer than Marcus could have guessed. Inside was a partnership agreement dated 1974, faded but legible, bearing two signatures at the bottom. One belonged to Charles Sinclair. The other belonged to a woman named Ruth Whitaker. Marcus read the document twice before he trusted himself to speak, his hands unsteady in a way they rarely were, because the paper in front of him made one fact undeniable. Ruth Whitaker had co-founded the original Sinclair in alongside his father, providing the capital that had saved the business from certain collapse during its very first year, a debt the company had never once publicly acknowledged. Grimes explained, in the careful, measured tone of a man finally allowed to set down a weight he had carried for decades, that Ruth had been pushed out of the partnership within 2 years, her name quietly removed from every official record, her actual stake in the company settled for a fraction of what she was legally owed. He had drafted the original agreement himself as a young associate, and he had also drafted the far smaller settlement that replaced it, though he had never fully understood, until years later, exactly why the second document existed at all. Marcus asked the only question that mattered now. Why had she been forced out? Grimes hesitated, then finally answered the question he had been waiting 30 years for someone to ask him directly. It was never about money, Grimes explained, and it was never really about business either. Eleanor, in the earliest years of her marriage to Charles, had watched her husband's growing partnership with Ruth Whitaker with an unease she never spoke aloud to anyone except, eventually, to the young lawyer entrusted with the paperwork. Ruth was brilliant, capable, and impossible not to notice, and Eleanor had seen, or believed she saw, something in the way Charles looked at her that terrified her far more than any business risk ever could. Rather than confront her husband directly, Eleanor had quietly maneuvered Ruth out of the partnership entirely, using leverage only a Sinclair wife could access, and had spent every year since making certain the truth stayed buried beneath paperwork, silence, and the slow erosion of memory. Marcus sat with that information for a long time after Grimes finished speaking, the pieces of his entire childhood rearranging themselves around a secret he never knew existed. Every story his mother had ever told about the company's founding suddenly sounded different, carefully edited, missing an entire person whose contribution had been erased so completely that even the family archives contained no trace of her. He thought of Denise, of her grandmother she rarely spoke about, of the name Whitaker that had unsettled his mother the very first time she saw it printed on an employment form. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once, the way truth often does when it has been buried far longer than it should have been. Ruth Whitaker was Denise's grandmother, and his mother had known it from the very first day. Every act of cruelty his mother had shown toward Denise suddenly made a different kind of sense, one that had nothing to do with class or household hierarchy, and everything to do with the fear Eleanor had carried silently for over 40 years. It was never really about a missing bracelet, or a friendship she considered improper, or a housekeeper she believed didn't belong in her son's life. It was about a woman terrified that the truth of her own marriage and the foundation of everything her family had built rested on an injustice she had orchestrated and never once found the courage to undo. Marcus left Grimes's office that night carrying documents that would change everything, unaware that the hardest conversation of his life was still waiting for him, back in the house where all of this had quietly begun. Marcus drove back to the estate that night with the folder sitting on the passenger seat beside him, unable to stop glancing at it every few minutes as though the paper itself might disappear before he had the chance to use it. He found his mother in her study, exactly where he expected her to be at this hour, a glass of wine untouched beside a stack of paperwork she wasn't actually reading. He placed the 1974 partnership agreement directly in front of her without a word of introduction, watching her face as recognition arrived, slow and unmistakable, the particular stillness of a woman finally confronted with a truth she had spent 4 decades outrunning. Eleanor did not reach for the document. She simply looked at it, then at her son, and said nothing for a long moment that felt far longer than it actually was. "You knew," Marcus said, his voice quieter than he expected it to be, quieter than the fury underneath it deserved. "You knew the moment you saw her name on that employment form, and you said absolutely nothing." Eleanor's hands, folded tightly in her lap, tightened further, though her expression remained composed in the disciplined way it always did, even now, even here. For the first time in Marcus's adult life, he watched his mother search for words and failed to find them immediately, the practiced calm she wore like armor slipping just slightly at the edges. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of its usual certainty, only the exhausted admission of someone who had rehearsed denial for so long she had almost convinced herself it was true. She did not deny the partnership. She did not deny forcing Ruth Whitaker out, or the settlement designed to look generous while quietly cheating her out of what she was actually owed. What she denied, quietly, was that any of it had ever been about business at all, though the admission that followed made that distinction almost meaningless. She had watched her husband work alongside Ruth for 2 years, had watched the easy respect between them curdle, in her mind, into something she couldn't bear to examine directly, and rather than risk losing him, she had simply removed the source of her fear. She had told herself, every year since, that she had protected her marriage. She had never once allowed herself to consider what it had cost the woman she'd erased to make that protection possible. Marcus asked her the question he had been carrying since Grimes's office, the one that mattered more than any settlement or signature. Did she understand what she had done to Denise, not decades ago, but this year, this month, using a young mother fighting for her son's life as collateral damage in a fear that had nothing to do with her at all? Eleanor's composure finally broke completely at that question, tears arriving with a suddenness that suggested they had been waiting behind her eyes for far longer than this single conversation. She admitted, in a voice stripped of its usual authority, that she had seen Ruth's face reflected in Denise's from the very first day, and had panicked, certain that history was somehow repeating itself, though the two women had never been anything alike beyond the name they shared. By morning, Marcus had gathered his mother, Vanessa, and Walter Grimes together in the same study, the documents spread across the desk where Eleanor had once tried so hard to keep them hidden. Vanessa's reaction was colder than her mother's, calculating even now, attempting to argue that whatever happened decades ago had no bearing on the company's current obligations. Grimes, however, finally freed from 30 years of professional silence, corrected her firmly, confirming on record that Ruth Whitaker's original stake, adjusted for the company's growth since 1974, represented a substantial and legally legitimate claim, one the family had simply never expected anyone to uncover. Vanessa's composure cracked slightly at the mention of legal legitimacy, the first real fear Marcus had seen in his sister's face in years. That fear turned to panic 3 days later, when Vanessa attempted to remove the remaining physical evidence from Grimes's office late one evening, unaware that Grimes, sensing exactly this possibility, had already recorded their earlier conversation and secured duplicate copies off-site. Confronted with the recording, Vanessa's calculated composure finally failed her entirely, and within the week, the board quietly accepted her resignation from her position as Chief Operating Officer, the company citing internal restructuring rather than the truth neither family wanted made fully public. Isabel Reyes, watching the scandal unfold from a careful distance, ended the engagement herself before the story could damage her own family's reputation, releasing a brief statement about mutual respect that fooled absolutely no one who had been paying attention. Marcus called a shareholders' meeting himself, before any reporter could piece the story together first, and stood in front of the same boardroom that had once heard his engagement announced without his consent. He told them the truth, plainly, without the softened language his family typically used to disguise uncomfortable history. Ruth Whitaker had co-founded this company. She had been erased from its records, cheated out of her rightful stake, and forced into silence by decisions made to protect a marriage rather than serve justice. He announced, formally, that her name would be restored to the company's founding history, and that her legal descendant, Denise Whitaker, would receive the equity owed to her grandmother, adjusted honestly for every year that debt had gone unpaid. Eleanor stood beside him as he said it, and for the first time in Denise's entire acquaintance with this family, offered an apology with nothing held back and nothing left to hide. Denise learned about the shareholders' announcement not from Marcus directly, but from Naomi, who called her at the hospital with a voice too excited to properly explain what she'd just seen reported online. Denise sat in the waiting room outside Elijah's pre-surgical unit, phone pressed to her ear, listening to her best friend read fragments of a press release describing her grandmother's name and a stake in a company Denise had only ever cleaned the floors of. It took her several minutes to fully absorb what this meant, not just historically, but immediately, practically, for the son currently being prepped down the hall for the surgery she had spent months believing she couldn't afford. Marcus arrived at the hospital himself less than an hour later, finding Denise exactly where he expected her, in a plastic chair too small for the weight of everything she was carrying. He didn't lead with business details or legal language. He simply told her that Elijah's surgery was covered, fully, permanently, not through charity or condition, but through money that had always legally belonged to her family, finally returned after 40 years of quiet theft. Denise cried then, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, not from grief this time, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of watching an impossible weight lift all at once, faster than she had ever imagined it could. The surgery itself took just under 6 hours, though Denise would later say it felt closer to a lifetime. Every minute stretched thin by fear she refused to fully voice out loud. Marcus stayed with her the entire time, not saying much, simply present in the way she had come to understand meant more to him than any speech could. When the surgeon finally emerged, tired but smiling, confirming the new valve was functioning exactly as hoped, Denise felt her knees genuinely weaken beneath her, catching herself against the nearest wall as relief finally arrived in a form she could actually hold on to. Elijah woke up groggy but unmistakably himself, blinking against the recovery room light, immediately asking whether the nice hotel man had stayed the whole time, as though that detail mattered just as much as the surgery itself. Marcus, standing at the foot of the bed, laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks, promising Elijah he had no intention of going anywhere anytime soon. Denise watched the two of them together, her son's hand small against the hospital blanket, Marcus leaning in close enough to hear every word, and understood, in that quiet room, that whatever this had cost them all, it had also given her something she never expected to find inside that enormous, lonely house. Eleanor visited the hospital 2 days later, alone, without an assistant or an appointment, carrying nothing but the kind of humility she had spent a lifetime avoiding. She apologized to Denise directly this time, not in a boardroom, not for an audience. Simply one woman speaking honestly to another about decades of fear that had cost an innocent family far more than it had ever protected her own. Denise didn't offer instant forgiveness, because some wounds take longer than a single conversation to close, but she listened, and for the first time, she saw not a cold matriarch defending her territory, but a frightened woman finally putting down a burden she had carried since before Denise was even born. The wedding took place 7 months later, on the same estate grounds where Denise had once pushed a cleaning cart through marble hallways that never once felt like they belonged to her. It was small, warm, and entirely unlike the merger ceremony Eleanor had once tried to arrange in Marcus's name. Eleanor walked Denise down the aisle herself, standing in for the family Denise had lost too early, her composure cracking only slightly as she placed Denise's hand in her son's. Elijah stood beside Marcus as best man, his suit still slightly too large for a boy who had grown stronger every month since his surgery, grinning the entire ceremony like a child who understood, better than most adults ever could, exactly how close this happiness had come to never happening at all. In the hotel lobby downtown, the original Sinclair and now restored and renamed to honor its true history, a new photograph hung near the entrance, one that had sat forgotten in a storage archive for over 40 years. It showed a young woman named Ruth Whitaker, standing proudly beside Charles Sinclair on the day their partnership began, her name finally printed beneath the image in full, no longer erased, no longer buried, no longer a secret anyone needed to protect. Denise stood in front of that photograph often in the years that followed, sometimes with Elijah, sometimes alone, always struck by how far one buried truth had traveled before it finally found its way back home. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.